So I want to welcome everybody for coming. We've got a few people coming. We know it's a big hockey game night, so thanks for joining us. We're very fortunate to have two. I don't even know if you're both from Winnipeg. I think originally you are. Well, Gerren, I think you are. Maybe Winnipeggers. So they're going to talk to us about working out in Winterpeg, which is great timing, and we've had great weather. So we're going to wait a couple more minutes. In previous talks, like, you know, if you need to ask a question, you just go to the chat box on the bottom and type something in. Gord will generally type something in to let everybody know how that works. Like I said, tonight's talk is with these two lovely people. And on Thursday, we have Dr. Glenn Bergeron. You should click in a second right there. He's going to talk about the aging knee and arthritis. And that's, oh, the date's wrong. That's Thursday, January 7th. Sorry. Today's Tuesday. So we'll wait a couple more seconds. Gord, if you want, I guess we can give the screen back to Gerren. Jackie, are you starting, I'm guessing? Because Gerren muted himself.
No, Gerren just muted.
Gerren?
I always forget.
I just muted so you didn't hear me clicking a bunch of things.
Oh.
I always forget that I should be quiet, so I should mute.
Oh. Just kind of like button it. Okay, well, it's 7 o'clock on the dot, so I think we're ready to go. So I'll let Gerren take the screen over. Gord to let people in from now on.
Just hit share screen, Gerren.
No, I'm just going to stop it. Yeah, we're good.
We're good. Okay, I'm going to mute myself, so have a good presentation, and I'll see you in 30.
Sounds good. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for showing up here. There's the big hockey game on tonight, so I'll talk fast. I can't say too much about my colleague here in terms of how she'll finish up. She's got the second half. But we just wanted to give you a little insight on working out in Winnipeg, and which is a common place that's known to have a little bit of a cold weather issue, especially through the winter months. So I'm Gerren McDonald. I won't give much more introduction to that. I'm a clinical exercise physiologist, as you can read there, as is Jacqueline Hay. And we'll kind of split up our piece here into two components. I'll start off and lead off with kind of the cold physiology on the body and how cold impacts us. And then Jacqueline will get into some more of the practical applications of things that you should be thinking about with considering going out and doing some physical activity outside and some of the other activities that may be involved in the winter months for you. So I'll get rolling here. Obviously, as we have different chats or different pieces, I'll try and answer any of those questions that come up as we're rolling along. And if there's any other questions, I think we have time at the end, and I think Gord just put that up. So just as we get started here, obviously, thanks to Reh-Fit for having us, and just Rhea and Gord and Sue and everyone for putting this together. I think these are a great idea for what's going on, and they laid out another great talk there for you guys on Thursday. Okay, so understanding body temperature. So it's not something that we necessarily think about all the time about our body temperature, and it's really because our body does a very good job of regulating it itself. Typically where we're all sitting is somewhere between kind of a 37 degrees Celsius core body temperature. For everyone there that prefers Fahrenheit, that'd be 98.6. In the Fahrenheit scale. And we don't necessarily sit there and think to ourselves, you know, is our body temperature right at this exact moment? Do we need to increase it or decrease it? Well, we generally have kind of a range that we can go through. And our body likes to be set at this, you know, steady temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. And we refer to that as homeostasis because that's where our body has the ability then to perform and function its best and you know, manage different things with regards to how our body reacts and recruits muscle and works. I'll try and stay away from all the geeky side of stuff on that piece and keep it to the main pieces. But when we look at those limits, there's kind of a safe range for us. And we talk a lot about, you know, working, you know, at the lower risk level to the higher risk level. And it gives us a full range of about 35 to 40 degrees is what our body's kind of core temperature could, you know, relate to. On a day-to-day variation, you'll probably go anywhere from, you know, 36 and a half to 37 and a half. So you might get about a 1 degree variation. But when we start to stress ourselves in heat and cold environments and with things like physical activity, all of a sudden we get into this scenario where our body temperature starts to change, and that can start to impact how our body functions overall. A good example of that, just in general, is to understand that when we start talking about physical activity and performance, that there's about a loss or a reduction of about 3% in muscular activity, or, the ability for a muscle to exert power for every about 1 degree Celsius that the muscle loses in temperature. So whether that's just basic physical activity or whether we start talking about elite athletes or anything along those lines, we know that a cold body, especially cold muscle, doesn't function as well. And so we don't really want to be cold because we know that that can start to limit what we're doing. So our goal then is to try and keep the body warm for overall functioning. Generally, when we're talking about this, we talk a lot about the core, which is where your kind of internal organs are. Start talking about the heart and the lungs and everything kind of to that region in the brain. And it's really where the body tries to protect core temperature when we look at kind of some of the adaptations and changes that are there. Based on the type of exposure that we have and the clothing that we wear. So we start talking about going outside and start talking about wind versus water and start dealing with other components with regards to how much clothing we're wearing and what type and activity we're doing and how intense that activity is. All of that can start to impact what happens to our core temperature, and our body has to respond to that. So we have this 37 as our kind of starting rate for our core temperature, 35, and we're going to spend most of our time talking about this low end. And if we ever get below 35, we start worrying in that range as the dangers of hypothermia. And in the heat and in the summer, we could talk about getting up above 40, where we'd worry more about the heat stroke side of things. The adaptations of what our body does is very good. Our body is very smart. It has a good way to kind of adapt with regards to, monitoring what's going on with our body temperature all the way through. And we simply kind of look at that as an integrated thermal signal. And our hypothalamus controls all that. It takes in all kinds of information about skin temperature and heart temperature and brain temperature. And it integrates all that information and determines what should your body do. And the body's way of managing the temperature and trying to produce different pieces in terms of increasing core temperature is generally done through either shivering or non-shivering mechanisms. So when we talk about the core on the diagram you can see there on the right side of your screen, this is really the core that the body tries to protect around the vital organs and maintain that temperature at all times for good stability within body functions. And with that said, we compromise what we refer to sometimes as the shell or the outer components in the periphery and the limbs by reducing the amount of blood flow that goes out there and the temperatures that are experienced out in the outer limbs. Shivering is just simply small muscle contractions. And the great part about shivering is it helps protect the core because every time you have a muscle contraction, you produce a lot of heat. So not only does a muscle contraction cause you to move, but the muscle contraction also produces, a heat component, and that heat loss allows us to warm our body. The downside to shivering is simply that it's very expensive on energy expenditure. So we don't want to spend a lot of time shivering because it will simply fatigue us out. If we start to get low on energy reserves or doing a lot of shivering, then we can start to worry about, hypothermia setting in and not being able to keep ourselves warm. So we don't really like to use shivering. However, it's a great way to warm up and one of the body's best defense systems. It's more the non-shivering component that our body uses when we start going outside to exercise in the cold. And it's kind of the first thing the body does, and it really bases itself around what happens with regards to your blood vessels. And we refer to this as vasoconstriction, or simply just the blood vessels starting to get smaller in size and how much blood gets sent out. And it's really the reason why you can start to feel cold in terms of like your toes and your feet earlier on, or really at any time, even just in general room components. Now we know that there's a lot of issues going on right now with the current pandemic that we're dealing with. So generally how we always teach this, and I'll only ask you to do this if you know your hands are clean and haven't been in contact with anybody else in the recent time, is if you want to know how room temperature is kind of determined, or if you to figure out if room temperature is good and suitable for yourself, there's an easy way to do it. And it's generally just take your hand and touch your lips. And if you take your hand and touch your lips, you'll know right away if the vasoconstriction in the blood vessels is occurring in your fingers. And what happens there is when you're a little cold, your fingers will feel cold on your lips. And if you're a little bit more warm and blood is flowing out there, your fingers will feel warm. You'll be able to determine whether you're in a warm or a cold environment based on that from room temperature. And it's the same thing we start to experience when we go outside. With that said, I'm sitting in my basement right now, so my fingers are freezing because I don't get a great bunch of air circulation down here, so I can feel the difference very easily. So our body uses that constriction to take blood away from the periphery and bring it back to the core and protect the core in that situation. You obviously can understand then, as we start to exercise, we need to bring blood back out to the periphery. So in that case, we're going to be sending blood out into the kind of the cold area of the body. And it'll produce a little bit of a conflict between where the body would ideally want to bring the blood in terms of vasoconstriction and then vasodilation of sending the blood out to the active muscles. But it becomes a very good balance when you're being physically active and does a very good job of protecting the body. So that's the kind of the physiological ways that the body protects itself. We as, individuals will protect ourselves by, simply just putting on more clothing. We'll curl up, right? Get under a blanket, or, we can apply more heat to ourselves so we can turn up the heat in different places. But we don't get that advantage necessarily when we go outside to exercise. So we got to plan for those things before we go. And then we got to understand what's going on with our body. When we look at what happens then when you're exercising in the cold, there's really kind of three main things that I want you to understand that's occurring with the body, especially for anybody that may be concerned about anything with regards to their cardiovascular system as they're performing their exercise. And those three things deal with heart rate, blood pressure, and then blood flow resistance. And that's because of that vasoconstriction component that we're talking about there. So anytime that you exercise, your heart rate goes up and your systolic blood pressure goes up. That's just common as you start working and doing a little bit more intensity. If you were just to go outside and not perform any exercise and you go into a cold environment, I'll use -10 as the kind of the cut point here. And if you go out into a -10 environment and just stand there, you'll actually see an increase in heart rate and an increase in blood pressure. And you'll also start to see an increase in resistance to blood flow. So when you start to combine that, and I decide to go out into a cold environment and do exercise, I now actually get a doubled impact. So I now get kind of two things, the exercise and the cold, impacting my heart rate and impacting my blood pressure. And I have this additional little bit of extra resistance to blood flow that's occurring or being developed from the cold environment. So that right away starts to deal with some of the alterations that are going on with our cardiovascular system and some of the concerns that we have as people go out to perform exercise in these environments. And understand that in the cases where they're going out to perform different activities, they can do that. It's just to understand that sometimes those activities can be a little more intense than what they're normally used to, and taking some precautions against that and, selecting a proper self-paced activity that they can do, are the easiest ways to kind of get around some of those components. When I use those words, when I get into those terms, talk a lot about what's happening with regards to cool and cold type environments. All right, so we know that we go through a wide range here in Manitoba of our different temperatures. And it's interesting that January 14th is generally our coldest day of the year. And January itself is usually our coldest month of the year and typically sits around about -16 Celsius. Because of that, as we go through our winter season, there's a bigger impact on our cardiovascular system when we look at exercising in cold environments than what we see when we talk about cool environments. And it seems to be right around that -10 area. So that -10 seems to be kind of the big component that we kind of highlight with regards to, okay, once it's past -10, we start considering this to be cold. And before that, we talk a little bit more about cool environments, but the body's pretty good to adapt itself and respond to cool environments as it goes. As we get into, different things, and we start adding things like wind and water or moisture, we start considering extra care with regards to kind of -26 and anything lower than that being an even more dangerous scenario. And the places where we start, sometimes seeing not doing programs outside or recommending, going in and doing some more of our virtual work that way. A way to look at that, a good acronym to kind of understand is one we talk a lot about in the environmental world, and is WET, right? And it's just wind, exposure, and time. Those are really the three major components that are there. So if it's roughly -10 out or 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're outside for about 30 minutes and your skin is exposed, that's when we can start to see frostbite and other cold injuries start to come into play. When you start to get into adding things like a windy environment into the component, well, that can reduce the temperature based on the wind chill effect and the exposure on the skin. And even worse is if you start to talk about wet and moisture. So water immersion is a much bigger heat loss factor. So if you immerse yourself in cold water, you'll lose heat about 20 times faster than if you do in air. So we obviously don't want to be in that environment, but the same type of concept goes into the concept behind wet clothing and what you're wearing, because the loss of heat can be impacted that way. So really, when we talk about what the body can do and what we try and bring across from just understanding cold and its impacts on us, we try and remind people that when they're doing activities outside in a cold environment, so especially we start getting into the -10 range and beyond, we talk a lot about making sure that you're wearing clean clothes, right? Prevent overheating, whether that's wearing clothes that don't breathe properly or trying to use different types of external heating devices and overheating yourself, because it'll make your clothes wet. And if your clothes become wet, they start to lose their insulation value. We talk about using loose clothing and layers, base layers and on, so that you can trap warm air around the body and kind of give yourself a little bit of a micro environment between yourself and the outdoor. And then mainly just staying dry, because dry is so important when we start talking about what's going to happen with regards to the insulation value of the clothing that you're wearing and the dangers of cold water. So those are kind of the big pieces that we use in that cold acronym to kind of run that through. Figured I'd just kind of finish off just saying, we're talking about base layers and staying dry and all that. And this is ideally what we would look at in terms of trying to recommend to people to do while they're trying to stay warm in a cold environment. So if you run down that left side of the screen there's kind of your cool environments, your cold environments, and then very cold. And we talk a lot about wearing, a base layer, then an insulating layer, which is commonly made of, a fleece type component, usually a little loose fitting. And then again, an outer layer, light coat through heavy coat that's likely going to have some wind and water resistance. And then we talk about, wool and socks and keeping feet dry, along with what's going to happen with regards to masks and hands and protecting kind of the hands and feet and keeping them warm and dry as they go through. Masks are very important. We're obviously wearing them a lot more right now, but in a cold environment and the inhalation of cold air, very cold air can have some additional impacts with regards to the cardiovascular system. But for the most part, the big piece about cold air hitting the face is just that it does have a initial impact and a little bit of a kind of a cold shock on an individual, water more than air, but it produces those responses in your cardiovascular system and your physiology. So simply just trying to, slowly progress into that and take your time and pacing wise. And then as you get into the exposure, your body will adapt. And when you're doing physical activity, your body do a very good job of defending its core temperature. I will leave myself there, and I'll turn you over to my fantastic colleague, Jacqueline Hay.
Now for the important stuff. Just kidding, Gerren. So what we're going to talk about today is talked about how to get ready, how to get dressed, but what should we do before we actually get active in the cold? So what we want to do is warm up. Warm-ups are always an important part of a workout, but in the cold, they're even more important because of that increased stress that the cold places on your cardiovascular system, like Gerren talked about, the higher blood pressure and the higher heart rate. So what I want you to think about when you're thinking about not doing your warm-up is think about starting your car after a cold night without wiping off any of the snow and just going and driving. It's a bad idea, and it's a bad idea for a variety of reasons. So I want you to try and think about treating your car or treating your body as nice as we treat our car in the winter. So again, we want to warm up the body by just walking around the house for 5 or 10 minutes. You can start in the base layer so you don't have to start sweating. Just walk around, same things you do in a normal workout. Your breathing should increase. You should start to feel warm. You should feel a gentle increase in your heart rate, and that'll help you get ready for the activity of going outside. And you don't have to worry about rushing out right after your warm up. You can actually just warm up gently in your base layer, and those effects and benefits of the increase in tissue temperature, warming up the joints, actually last 10 minutes. So you can just slowly get dressed and get ready to go outside. Okay, next slide. Okay, and one of the things I really want you to focus on, especially if you're going out in the cold to shovel, is warm-ups are really important, especially for shoveling. So shoveling puts an even more stress on your cardiovascular system, and there's some real key reasons why. Specifically, your heart has to work harder because not only because of the cold, but because your upper body's doing most of the work. So when you think about the big muscles in your legs, they have really big blood vessels. So when your muscles are contracting, they put pressure on your heart because your heart has to work harder as those vessels are compressed. When we think about our upper body muscles have way smaller blood vessels. So every time those muscles are contracting, you're seeing a much higher increase in pressure. So your heart has to work even harder to pump against the pressure and to get the blood to the working muscles. So again, that's why we really want to focus on the warm-up before we work. And there's some other key things to consider too to shovel safely. So just like all the professionals at Reh-Fit tell you, technique is important. So technique in a squat, technique in a push-up, technique in any type of band exercise is very important, and shoveling doesn't have to be dangerous. So what you want to focus on is, again, keeping your back straight, because you don't want to be bending from your back and causing any type of injury that way. You also want to think about bending at your hips, so you're using most of your legs, bending your knees, and as much as possible, we want to really focus on pushing snow rather than lifting. So again, if we're lifting that snow, we're working and engaging more of that upper body, and we're going to cause way more of an increase in our blood pressure and heart rate. So when we focus on pushing the snow, we can focus on moving it forward, decreasing that workload on the heart. And again, push, don't twist. So I'll get you to go to the next slide. So the other thing to consider as we're outside and shoveling is having the right tool for the job. So what you want to have, so if we have a longer shovel handle while we're pushing, it's going to help us keep that technique and help us keep upright, so we're not hunching. So we're not hunching and we're not using bad technique. Another key thing that Gerren talked about as well is really pacing yourself. You don't have to get it all done at once. Take shorter passes. What I usually do with my driveway is kind of cut it up into a different grid and just do shorter passes. So you're pushing much less with each load. And again, if you have someone else, go do it as a team or break it up over time. Another key thing, just remember to take your medications as prescribed. So you're given these different drugs for perhaps diabetes, blood pressure, or heart rate. It's always important to take them, and it's especially important to take them in winter with activities. So a lot of the research shows that activities in the cold are much safer when you're taking your medications as prescribed, because they allow your heart and your body to function as best as possible in the cold. Another thing to be really careful about, and I had this happen already today. I went for a walk and was not careful of where I went, and I ended up in a snowbank. So you want to be careful of your footing, but I was also jaywalking, so that doesn't count. Try and make sure that you have good grip on your shoes. If you're finding it's really icy and you have some trouble, maybe get the yak tracks or the things that go underneath your shoes to increase your grip. The other thing you can do is make sure you're going to places where they're well groomed, there's sand, there's things that you can see. So if there is ice, you can see it and try and avoid it. And as much as possible, plan ahead for that activity. So again, it's always great to go out and enjoy the outdoors. It's great for our mental health, especially with being stuck inside all the time. But I want you to plan ahead. So think about the weather. Is it really windy? Is it minus 26? And maybe, you know what, it's not a great day to go outside. If it is really windy, maybe make sure to go to an enclosed space with lots of tree or forest around, which is really good for our brain and health, but also protects us from that cold wind. And tell someone where you're going. If you can go out for a walk with your friend that's part of your quarantine group, or even if not, tell someone where you're going in advance. So again, they know where you're going and when you'll be home. Next slide. So the great thing is that we have some really great winter activities that we have access to here in Winnipeg. So outside of those excellent 100, I think you have almost 100 workouts that you have available to you online. It's great to enjoy something outdoors. So Winnipeg has free access to cross-country skis, skating, walking trails, tobogganing, all sorts of different things that you can do. And there's information that you can check out right on the City of Winnipeg outdoor recreation page. So you can see maps, where to go, how long the trails are, and most importantly, if there's any restrictions. So again, if you're going out, make sure to plan ahead, check the website out to see if there's any trails that are closed, or maybe there's a different restriction due to the pandemic that you can check out. Next slide. And again, in Manitoba, we have such great access to parks. So you know what, if you had enough of the city and being in town, we have access to lots of different provincial parks, even within an hour drive or less. And you can come check out great groomed trails for skiing, walking, hiking, or just being somewhere else, which is very enjoyable this time. And again, on the Manitoba Parks website, there's some really great up-to-date information for you to see the maps, where to go and what to do. Okay, next slide. And again, along with that planning piece, really try and plan the activity to your capabilities. So as an example, there's a bunch of ski trails in Winnipeg. What it tells you is, when is it open? What's the lighting like? What's the distance? So I know when my first time going out skiing or biking for the year, I usually want to start with a much smaller distance. So in this case, I probably wouldn't want to go to Windsor Park and do a 10-kilometer loop, because if I got really tired, it would be kind of hard to get back to the start. So you want to try and pace yourself and try and find something that maybe matches what your goal is for the day, or even just to have the map so you know where you are, so you don't get lost, or to maybe do a shorter trail. So on the right there is a picture of one of the hiking trails out in the Whiteshell. It shows you where all the signs are, where to go, and how to follow it. So again, I highly recommend checking it out in advance to plan your day and your trip. Next slide. And again, unfortunately, we just have pandemic come out of our mouths every 4 seconds, and it's something we always have to consider. Being outside is great because there are lower rates of transmission, but we still have to make sure we're being careful as best we can by staying at least 2 meters apart from people that aren't in your household or part of your group. Very important to follow kind of the signs and the trail signs. For example, on different trails, they're just like the supermarket. So you know when you go down the supermarket, you can only go one way, and then the next aisle, you have to go this way. So you end up going around the store multiple times if you're going. Different trails in the city right now are having different directions. So the skating rink over near Cindy Clausen is open, but you can only travel in one direction. And in that case, you have to wear a mask. So remember to kind of follow the signs and follow the protocols, and unfortunately keep up to date because they're changing over time. Okay, next slide. Okay, so basically if you can take 3 things from this talk that Gerren and I gave, we really want you to think about that acronym COLD, because that COLD acronym is going to keep you from having frostbite and cold related injuries. So again, clean clothes, try and prevent yourself by overheating by wearing lots of loose layers, and as much as possible to stay dry. More than anything, I think out of everything we've talked about, warming up is the most important thing you can do before going outside to keep your heart health safe. So again, think about trying to go on the highway at 100 kilometers per hour, without warming up your vehicle, without, wiping off your mirror, without taking off the ice. We can't do that. We want to make sure you're nice and warmed up for the activity. And 3, try and plan ahead. Know what the weather is, know what the conditions are. Let somebody know where you're going. If you have somebody that you can go with, it's always great to go with a friend, and make sure you're following all those protocols. With that, I guess we'd really like to thank you for your time. And if there's any questions, Gerren will answer them all. Just joking. Yes.
So again, if there are any questions, like Jacqueline said, you can ask them with the chat box, and you can just type them in, and then between the 3 of us, we'll try and navigate if there's anything doing. Hopefully all of you are taking advantage of our very mild winter that we've had thus far, and it's been very fortunate that we don't have to have those -40 temperatures that we have to deal with. So everybody's got lots of opportunity to get outside, or everybody's chomping at the bit and going ready for the hockey game. Maybe, Gerren, that's what you predicted. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's kind of what we predicted.
I can't fully blame them for that, but just in case that's what they wanted, we'll
we had that prepped.
go along that
well, at
way.
least it's not at the same time as the game. So this is a good preface. Everybody can go for a quick walk because the game doesn't start for a little while, and then they can all have a seat and watch the game tonight. So I'll give it a couple minutes. But nobody's had too many questions just yet. Again, we have another talk on Thursday with Dr. Glenn Bergeron. That's about the aging knee and arthritis, I believe. So we'll be for that one on Thursday. And I guess if anybody else has a question, I don't know, no one's coming up with anything. I will say good night and thank you for your presentations. And Jacqueline will touch base. Oh, someone typed in something just before I go. Oh no, it's Gord. Oh no, it's the members. Sorry.
No.
Thanks for them.
Thanks, Jan. Yeah, no, that.
Gord was asking earlier. So. Thanks, Jan. Sorry, I saw Gord's name. So anyway, that's everybody has the same sentiments. Thanks for you guys for your time.